I'll never forget the moment my father stood up at our Thanksgiving dinner and dropped a bombshell that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. It was supposed to be one of those rare nights where we all came together. Turkey carved, laughter shared, and old grudges tucked away under the tablecloth. Instead, it became the night I finally stepped out of the shadows. The dining room was warm, filled with the smell of roasted turkey, garlic mashed potatoes, and sweet cranberry sauce. My mother, Clara, had gone all out this year, her way of holding the family together even as cracks grew wider every year. My siblings, Ethan and Madison, were already halfway through the wine, loud as ever. They had always been the center of attention, the golden children in my father's eyes. I was just Harper, the quiet one, the girl with a sharp tongue she kept hidden behind polite silence. We were seated around the long oak table that had hosted decades of Thanksgivings. My father, Richard Lane, sat at the head like a king on his throne. He was a man who demanded attention without ever asking for it. His deep voice, his sharp eyes, his presence that filled the room like a storm cloud. The restaurant empire he built, Lane's Bistro Group, was his crown jewel, and in his mind, it defined us. Everything was about the business. Everything was about legacy. For a few minutes, it felt almost normal. Ethan bragged about the new Porsche he had just bought. Madison complained about the humidity in Miami, where she'd spent the summer. My mother smiled weakly, trying to laugh at their jokes, while I sat quietly, swirling the deep red wine in my glass, more of an observer than a participant. That was the role I had grown used to, invisible, underestimated, dismissed. But then, out of nowhere, my father stood up. He tapped his glass with a knife, the sharp ring cutting through the chatter. The room stilled. He raised his glass high, his eyes sweeping across us like he was addressing a boardroom. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice booming with authority. "As of next month, Lane's Bistro Group will no longer be in our family's hands. I've decided to sell." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and sharp. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the china. I wasn't the only one stunned. My mother gasped softly, her hand trembling against the table. But then, something happened I didn't expect. Ethan clapped. Madison cheered. "Finally, Dad!" Ethan grinned, lifting his glass. "You deserve a break. Let someone else run the empire. You've carried it long enough." Madison raised her glass too, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Cheers to freedom. No more stress. No more late nights. You deserve to enjoy life now." They were smiling, celebrating, as if the news meant they had just won the lottery. They didn't care about the company itself. They just assumed Dad's decision meant more money, more comfort, more handouts in the future. I didn't clap, I didn't cheer. Instead, I took a slow sip of wine, letting the tannins burn on my tongue. Inside, my chest was pounding, but on the outside, I stayed calm. "Who's the buyer, Dad?" I asked softly, my voice cutting through their laughter. My father's face broke into a grin of pride, like a man revealing his masterstroke. "Summit Enterprises," he announced. "Sharpest company I've ever dealt with. They're paying $80 million. Cash." Ethan whistled. $80 million? That's insane. Dad, you're a legend. Madison clapped her hands together, beaming. "Summit Enterprises. That name even sounds powerful. You always make the best deals." I set my glass down carefully, my fingers steady despite the storm raging inside me. My heart raced, not because of the sale itself, but because of the name. Summit Enterprises. The name they were all toasting to. The company my father admired so deeply. The company he thought was his crowning achievement in negotiation. They didn't know. None of them knew. Summit Enterprises was mine. I had built it in silence, brick by brick, deal by deal, while they all dismissed me as nothing more than the quiet daughter with no ambition. Every late night, every risk, every sleepless morning had led to this moment. My father thought he was outsmarting the world. He had no idea he was handing his empire over to his own daughter. As I sat there, the weight of the secret pressed against my chest. My siblings laughed. My father basked in his own pride. My mother sat frozen, and I knew this Thanksgiving would not end like the others. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes fixed on my father. In that moment, I decided the time for silence was over. Long before that Thanksgiving dinner, I had already learned my place in the Lane family, or rather, the place they decided for me. My name is Harper Lane. I'm 32 years old, the middle child of Richard and Clara Lane, and for most of my life, I've been invisible in my own family. My father, Richard, is the kind of man people write business magazines about. Self-made, tough as nails, a man who turned one small diner into Lane's Bistro Group, a chain of restaurants scattered across the East Coast. To outsiders, he was a success story. To me, he was a mountain I was never meant to climb. From the time I was little, I was quiet. I read books while Ethan, my older brother, wrestled with Dad in the backyard. I stayed up drawing business ideas in notebooks while Madison, my younger sister, performed for applause in the living room. Ethan was Dad's heir, the loud, confident son who mirrored his ambition. Madison was his darling, the bubbly princess who never had to work a day in her life. And me? I was the soft one. The girl my father said would never make it in a world of sharks. Harper, he used to say, shaking his head when I tried to join conversations about the restaurants. You're too sensitive. Business requires steel, not sentiment. At first, I believed him. I convinced myself I wasn't cut out for that world. But something inside me never stopped burning. I wanted to prove that being quiet didn't mean being weak. I went to college, studied finance, and while Ethan and Madison spent their summers sailing in Martha's Vineyard, I took internships in grim offices where I learned how money really moved in the shadows. My father never asked about my work. He never cared. To him, if I wasn't part of Lane's Bistro, I didn't matter. My mother, Clara, was different. She noticed. She saw me. She wasn't the kind of woman to fight with Richard. Decades of living under his strong will had softened her voice. But she always found ways to remind me I wasn't invisible. Little notes tucked in my lunchbox when I was young. A phone call after every job interview. At Thanksgiving, she always made sure my favorite dish, brown sugar sweet potatoes, was at the table, even if no one else touched them. But in that family, love wasn't loud enough to drown out dismissal. Ethan strutted like the crown prince. Madison floated like royalty, and I became the ghost in the room. That's why I left. At 25, I moved to New York City. I found work in private equity, buying, selling, and reshaping companies. I was a beginner, ignored, underestimated, but that suited me. No one saw me coming. Over the years, I learned how to negotiate, how to see opportunity where others saw failure, how to turn silence into power. And slowly, piece by piece, I built something of my own, something my family didn't know existed. Summit Enterprises. I started with nothing but a small loan and a sharp eye for undervalued businesses. I took risks others wouldn't, trusted my instincts, and reinvested every dollar back into the company. By 32, Summit wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We had real capital, real power, and the kind of reputation that made even industry giants pay attention. But here's the thing, my family never asked. They never once picked up the phone to say, "What are you working on, Harper?" To them, I was just the odd daughter who left. They thought I was probably struggling in a cubicle, living off takeout, invisible as ever. And in a way, that invisibility became my armor. That's what made coming home for Thanksgiving such a strange decision. I hadn't been back in 2 years, but when Mom called, her voice warm and hopeful, I couldn't say no. "Just one night, Harper," she said. "Your father's in good spirits. It might be different this time." Different. That word lingered with me. So I went. I drove down to Connecticut, rehearsing how I would keep my guard up. I promised myself I wouldn't let their jabs sting, that I wouldn't flinch when Ethan smirked or when Dad ignored me. When I walked into the house, nothing had changed. The same heavy oak, furniture. The same family portraits of Ethan shaking hands with Dad at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, of Madison smiling in designer dresses, and me, nowhere on the walls. At dinner, the routine was familiar. Ethan boasting about deals he didn't make, Madison gushing about her newest shopping spree, my father nodding proudly at them both. My mother sitting quietly trying to balance plates and peace. And me, Harper, sipping my wine in silence, letting them believe I was still the ghost. But I wasn't the ghost anymore. Not really. I was sitting at that table with a secret bigger than anything they could imagine. While they talked over me, while they dismissed me, I knew something they didn't. I wasn't powerless anymore. So when my father stood and made his announcement, I was ready in a way I hadn't even realized. Years of being ignored had prepared me for the moment when silence would become my sharpest weapon. And that night, in the house where I was always unseen, the world was about to see me for the very first time. The moment my father raised his glass, the air in the dining room shifted. His voice, deep and commanding, cut through the clatter of cutlery and the hum of casual conversation. "I've made my decision," he declared, looking down the table as though he were addressing not his family, but shareholders at a quarterly meeting. "Lane's Bistro Group will no longer belong to us. I've agreed to sell." The words hit harder than any punch. I gripped my wine glass tighter, my fingers slick against the stem. Lane's Bistro wasn't just a company. It was the backbone of our family, the empire my father had built from a single greasy diner in Boston 35 years ago. It was our history carved into menus and restaurant signs across the East Coast. And just like that, with one sentence, he had erased it from our hands. My mother gasped, her napkin slipping from her lap. "Richard, you can't mean—" But she didn't finish. My father was already pressing forward, his face shining with pride. "It's time. I've carried this company long enough. I've secured us a future. None of you need to worry about the business anymore." What struck me wasn't just the announcement. It was the way he said us. My father had never been one to share anything, not power, not control, not credit. And then, before I could even process the weight of it, Ethan broke into a grin. "Finally, Dad, it's about time. You deserve this. You've worked harder than anyone I know." He raised his glass, already toasting. Madison clapped her hands like a child opening presents. "Cheers! No more late nights, no more stress. We should celebrate. This is amazing." They were beaming, celebrating, laughing. I stared at them, stunned. My siblings weren't shocked. They weren't upset. They were cheering the death of our family legacy. 80 million, my father continued, puffing out his chest. "That's what they're paying cash. Summit Enterprises. The sharpest negotiators I've ever met. I'm proud to hand it over to them." My stomach twisted. My heart leapt into my throat. Summit Enterprises. I knew that name better than anyone else at that table, because I had built it. It was mine. Every sleepless night, every deal I'd chased, every ounce of grit I'd poured into something no one believed in, it all led to this moment. And here was my father, declaring to the family that he had outsmarted the world by selling his empire to strangers, not realizing he just handed it over to me. The irony was crushing. Ethan slapped the table. "Dad, you're a genius. 80 million. You always win, don't you?" Madison leaned in toward me, smirking. "Can you believe this, Harper? Summit Enterprises. Doesn't the name just sound powerful? Dad really knows how to pick the best." Her words stung, not because of the insult, but because of the blind arrogance. They had spent their lives belittling me, dismissing me as the quiet one, the weak one. And here they were, praising the very thing I had created, unknowingly raising a glass to me. I forced myself to stay calm. I swirled my wine in slow circles, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. "Who's the buyer, Dad?" The room stilled for a moment. My siblings looked at me like I'd just asked the obvious. My father smirked, proud of himself. "Summit Enterprises," he said again, savoring the name. 80 million, Harper, the best deal of my life." I nodded, keeping my face unreadable. Inside, though, my pulse raced like a drum. "Harper," Ethan said, shaking his head with a mocking grin, "you should be taking notes. This is how real business is done." Madison chimed in, her voice syrupy and condescending. "Don't worry, Harper, you'll benefit from this too. Dad will make sure we're all taken care of." Taken care of? That's how they saw me, a helpless child in need of handouts. I let them talk, let them toast, let them laugh at my expense. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that beneath their smugness, beneath my father's pride, beneath their blind trust, everything was about to shift. But as the laughter grew louder and the toasts kept coming, I felt something else rising inside me. Not just anger, not just vindication, but a storm of conflicting emotions. This was my father, the man who raised me, The man who taught me through cruelty what it meant to survive. I should have felt triumph at having outsmarted him. Instead, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and rage, pride and grief, because I realized in that moment he still didn't see me. Even when he was bragging about selling to my company, he had no idea it was mine. He thought I was nothing, and that was the real conflict. Not the sale, not the money, but the years of invisibility, the years of dismissal, all culminating in this one night where my silence weighed more than their cheers. So I sat there, sipping my wine, feeling the fire build inside me. I didn't know when I would speak, but I knew I would. And when I did, nothing in this family would ever be the same again. The laughter around the table swelled, filling the room with a sense of triumph that felt like salt in an open wound. Ethan was on his third toast, Madison was already talking about vacations they could now afford, and my father sat tall, basking in their admiration. He looked like a king who had just secured his dynasty's legacy, blind to the fact that his children weren't mourning the loss of the empire, only celebrating what they thought would be their share of the spoils. I stayed quiet. My wine glass was almost empty, but I held it in my hand like it was an anchor. The fire inside me had shifted from shock to resolve. I had spent years listening to them, letting their voices drown mine out, swallowing every insult, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked. Tonight, though, I felt something click into place. For the first time, I realized this wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the company. It was about identity. About finally stepping out of the role they had written for me, the invisible daughter who never measured up. I leaned back in my chair, watching them. Ethan was practically glowing, pounding his fist on the table with every word. $80 million, Dad, that's legendary. You always knew how to close a deal. Madison giggled, twirling her hair around her finger. Summit Enterprises, what a perfect name. They must be brilliant, Dad. I can't wait to see what they do with the restaurants. Finally, no more stress for you. We can all relax. I wanted to laugh. They were praising me without realizing it, glorifying a faceless company that was, in reality, my creation. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Harper, Ethan said suddenly, turning his grin toward me, don't you think Dad's a genius? This is how business is really done. Take notes. My jaw clenched. His words felt like the echo of my father's voice from my childhood, always reminding me that I wasn't cut out for this world. For a moment, anger flared so hot I nearly spoke right then. But I stopped myself. Timing mattered. I had learned that in business. Sometimes silence was the sharpest weapon. So instead, I lifted my glass slightly, forcing a small smile. "It's an impressive deal, Dad," I said softly, my eyes locked on his. "Summit Enterprises must be very persuasive." He chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. "Sharpest team I've ever gone against. Ruthless negotiators. They knew their worth and didn't back down." Reminded me of myself when I was younger. That was it, the last straw. He was unknowingly describing me, my strategy, my persistence, my refusal to yield. He was praising the qualities he'd spent years telling me I didn't have. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, sensing the tension in my silence. She had always known when I was holding back. Her hand brushed mine gently under the table, a quiet reminder that I didn't have to fight, but I knew I did. I thought back to the long nights in New York, the deals I had clawed my way through, the countless times I'd been underestimated only to come out ahead. Every sacrifice, every lonely moment, every victory I couldn't share with my family, it all led to this. This was the moment I had been waiting for, though I hadn't known it until now. I placed my glass down slowly, deliberately. My movements were calm, but inside, adrenaline surged through me like a river, about to burst its banks. "Dad," I said, my voice steady, louder this time so no one could mistake my words. "You said Summit Enterprises is the buyer?" He nodded proudly. "That's right, smartest people I've met in years." "Interesting," I replied, my eyes never leaving his, because I know them very well. The laughter paused. Ethan frowned, confused. Madison tilted her head, still smirking, but uncertain. My mother's hand froze on the edge of the table. My father narrowed his eyes as though he was finally seeing me as more than background noise. This was the decision point, the crossroads. I could stay silent, let them remain blind, and continue being invisible. Or I could take everything I had built, everything I had become, and place it squarely in the center of the table for them to see. For 32 years, I had been dismissed, ignored, overlooked. Tonight, I decided that ended. I straightened in my chair, pushing it back slightly as if to give myself room to breathe. My voice dropped lower but carried a weight that silenced the room. I know Summit Enterprises so well, I said slowly, because I am Summit Enterprises. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, heavy and undeniable. In that moment, everything shifted. My decision was made. The silence that followed was louder than any cheer, any toast, any insult they had ever thrown my way. I had finally stepped into the light. I am Summit Enterprises. The words slipped from my mouth like a blade, sharp and final. The dining room froze. Forks stopped midair, glasses hung suspended, halfway to lips. Even the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to fall silent. My father blinked once, then again, as though he hadn't heard me correctly. His proud grin faltered, replaced by confusion. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Ethan let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head. "You," he scoffed, pointing at me with his fork. "Good one, Harper. You almost had me for a second." But when I didn't smile, when I didn't flinch, his laughter choked off into silence. Madison shifted uncomfortably, her smirk fading. I reached calmly into my bag, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table toward my father. "Contracts," I said. "Signed. Stamped. Summit Enterprises is me. Always has been." Richard's hands, the same hands that once carried trays of food in that first little diner, hovered above the folder. He hesitated, then opened it. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, and I watched the color drain from his face. "This—" His voice cracked, then steadied. "This can't be right. I dealt with a team, a board. You're telling me—" "I built that team," I cut in, my voice firmer now. "Every acquisition, every deal, every signature, it all came through me. I am Summit Enterprises. You thought you were selling to strangers, Dad. You were selling to me." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. Ethan slammed his glass down, wine sloshing onto the tablecloth. "No way, you're lying. Summit is huge. Harper, you couldn't have built that. You're just what?" I snapped, turning on him for the first time. "Just the quiet one? Just the invisible daughter? That's exactly why you never saw me coming. You were too busy basking in Dad's approval to realize I was building something bigger than all of you combined." Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked to Dad for backup, but Richard was still staring at the contract, his pride unraveling before my eyes. Madison finally spoke, her voice trembling. "But you never said anything. You never told us." I laughed bitterly. "Would you have listened? Would any of you have cared? Every time I tried to talk about my work, I was ignored or mocked. So I stopped trying to explain myself. Instead, I let my results speak, and here they are, right in front of you." My mother's eyes glistened with tears. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "Harper, I always knew you were stronger than he gave you credit for." My father finally looked up. His face was hard, unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of betrayal. "You tricked me. You went behind my back. No, I interrupted, my voice steady. "I learned from you. You told me business was war. You told me only the ruthless survive. So I played the game the way you taught me, quietly, strategically, without mercy. I didn't trick you, Dad. I outplayed you." The words landed like a punch. My father leaned back in his chair, stunned into silence. For a man who always had the last word, the quiet that followed was louder than any argument. Ethan shook his head violently. "This is insane. Dad, say something. Tell her she's lying." But Richard said nothing. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with something I had never seen before. Fear. Madison whispered, almost to herself, "Summit Enterprises. Harper Lane." as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had been in front of her all along. The power dynamic at that table had shifted in an instant. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't towering over me. My siblings weren't mocking me. They were all staring, waiting for me to explain, to justify, to soften the blow. But I didn't. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier. I held my father's gaze as I raised my glass one last time. "You always said I'd never survive in your world," I said. "But here's the truth, Dad. I didn't just survive. I won." The silence shattered like glass. My mother sobbed quietly. Ethan stormed out of the room, muttering curses under his breath. Madison sat frozen in disbelief, and my father, Richard Lane, the unshakable king of Lane's Bistro, sat in stunned silence, dethroned by the very daughter he had overlooked all his life. And me? I took a slow sip of wine, savoring the taste of victory, not the victory of money or power, but of finally being seen. The silence after my reveal lingered longer than any prayer or toast ever had at that table. The weight of truth had sunk into every corner of the dining room, smothering the warmth of Thanksgiving and replacing it with something colder, sharper. Ethan was the first to move. He shoved his chair back with a loud scrape against the hardwood floor, his face twisted with disbelief. "This is a joke," he muttered, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. "She's lying. She has to be lying." But the contracts were still in front of my father, black ink on white paper, undeniable proof. Ethan glanced at them once, then looked away. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. He stormed out of the room, muttering curses I didn't bother to follow. The slam of the front door echoed like a gunshot. Madison sat frozen, her wine glass untouched for once. She kept shaking her head, her blonde curls bouncing with each movement. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice thin. "Harper, you can't be Summit. I never told you," I said flatly, "because you never asked." Her eyes welled up not with pride or joy, but with confusion, like the ground beneath her had shifted and she couldn't find her footing. For someone who had always lived on the surface, never digging deeper, the truth was too much to absorb in one night. She excused herself quietly, slipping out of the dining room without meeting my eyes. That left only my mother and my father. Clara reached across the table, her trembling fingers finding mine. For years she had been the only one who tried to remind me I mattered, the only one who had glimpsed the strength my father refused to see. Tears streaked her cheeks, but there was a small smile beneath them. "I always knew," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "I always knew you had something they couldn't see. I'm so proud of you, Harper." Her words hit me harder than I expected. All those years of quiet encouragement, of small acts of love, had carried me through when no one else did. I squeezed her hand back, silently thanking her for being the anchor I had needed when I was drifting. Then there was my father. Richard Lane sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the contracts like they were a mirror showing him something he couldn't accept. His shoulders, once squared with pride, now sagged under the weight of realization. When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale, his voice hoarse. "You outplayed me," he said. The words weren't admiration, they were an accusation. His eyes searched mine, not for understanding, but for weakness, for some way to reclaim the ground he had lost. "No," I replied, holding his gaze. "I became what you taught me to be, ruthless, strategic, relentless. You just never thought I'd use those lessons against you." His lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time in my life, my father had no retort, no lecture, no condescending remark to put me back in my place. He simply sat there silent, his empire gone, his pride shattered, not by a competitor, but by his own daughter. I stood slowly, the scrape of my chair loud in the quiet room. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't triumphant. What I felt was heavier than victory. It was the weight of years of being unseen, finally crashing down in one defining moment. I walked to the window, looking out at the autumn leaves swirling in the cold wind outside. "You know what the difference is between us, Dad?" I asked, not turning back to face him. "You built Lane's Bistro to prove you mattered. I built Summit to prove I did. The empire was never the point. Being seen was." Behind me, I heard my father's breath catch, though he said nothing. My mother's soft sobs filled the silence instead. I turned back to the table one last time. The contract still lay there, glaring proof that the overlooked daughter had done the impossible. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in that house. I didn't feel invisible. I felt whole. I picked up my glass, poured myself one final measure of wine, and raised it. Not to my father, not to my siblings, but to myself. "For years, you told me I'd never make it in your world," I said softly. "But I did. And the lesson I've learned is this. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or an empire. It's the strength to prove you never needed their approval to begin with." I took a sip, savoring the bitterness and the warmth all at once. Then I set the glass down and walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the man who had never seen me and the family who finally at long last did. That night, I didn't just own Summit Enterprises, I owned my story, and that was worth more than $80 million. And that's the story of the Thanksgiving night that changed everything for me. The night my father finally saw me, not as the quiet daughter he dismissed, but as the woman who built something greater than he ever imagined. Sometimes, life doesn't hand you the legacy you expect. Sometimes you have to build your own. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family, your own battles, or the power of proving yourself when no one believes in you, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps more people find this story. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been underestimated only to rise above it? Your stories inspire me just as much as I hope mine inspired you. Also, if you know someone who needs a reminder of their strength, share this video with them. Sometimes a single story can change the way someone sees themselves. Finally, if you want more powerful, real-life storytelling like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We've got more stories coming your way that will shake you, move you, and remind you just how strong people can be when they refuse to stay invisible. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, stay strong, stay seen, and never stop writing your own story.